Hi, I'm Jeff May. I'm an attorney at Kerr, Russell & Weber in Detroit, specializing in data privacy and cybersecurity law. I'm also a certified information privacy professional and a certified information privacy manager. I'd like to thank you for taking the time today to watch this presentation. I know we're all facing new challenges right now, and my hope is that the information I can provide today will help you make some informed decisions when it comes to your business's data practices. As you can see, our focus today will be pandemic-related data privacy and cybersecurity challenges. Now, what you'll find is that while there are certainly a lot of challenges to address, many of these challenges were present even before the pandemic. Now, though, they're more readily apparent, and they impact a greater number of businesses. Before we get into those challenges, I always find it helpful to spend just a little bit of time discussing the difference between data privacy and data security. Then we'll get into some discussion about the collection and use of data, some compliance issues to consider when working remotely, and finally, some of the security challenges that have really come to the forefront over the last few months. Now, what do you think of when you hear the term data privacy? My guess is you probably think of things like hackers, viruses, identity theft, malware, ransomware, all those hot-button issues that you hear about in the press. But what do you think about when you hear the term data security? Well, it's probably the same thing, right? That's often an overlooked distinction between these two areas of law and technology. Now, I'd like to start with one of my favorite sayings in the privacy field. You can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. I want you to think about that as we go through these next few points. So let's start there. What exactly is data security? Data security is primarily about protecting confidential data, but it's critical to note that it doesn't really matter what that data is. It might be personal information or health information or confidential business information or trade secrets. The point is it needs to be protected. And what drives that protection is threat analysis. What are the threats to the data we're trying to protect? What kind of bad actors are after the information? What vulnerabilities does your system have? And what security policies, procedures, and technologies can you put in place to mitigate those threats? And all of this is, of course, a function of IT, right? For example, HR and sales aren't directly involved in developing security protocols or implementing security technologies. Now, to be fair, security is driven by users. Ultimately, the data is there to be used, right? It needs to be accessible. In the security field, we refer to the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That is, information can be secure but unavailable, making it relatively worthless. That said, most security professionals will tell you that the biggest security threat in any company is its own internal users. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Now, before we move on, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk for a bit on some of the major security threats out there today, particularly in light of COVID-19. Now, none of these are new, but it's worth noting that attackers have become more sophisticated and creative. In fact, Google noted that in light of the pandemic, Gmail was blocking an average of 18 million COVID-19 related phishing emails every day. And when ransomware attacks are successful, companies today are more likely to pay the ransom because network access is so vital to their business in a remote landscape. You'll also note, I'm sure, that I have privacy violations listed here. We'll talk shortly about privacy laws, but you should note that regulators are starting to ramp up enforcement of privacy law violations. Now, I always find war stories helpful, so let me share a few examples of things we've seen over the last year. Now, the first one of these is a story about a situation where there was a phishing attempt, that's a voice phishing attempt, on a secretary at a local business. What happened here is the secretary received a call late on a Friday from an individual. We'll call him Jim. He called up and he said, hey, is the president of the company available? And he named the president by name. And she said, no, he's not, but can I transfer you to his secretary? The secretary took the call. She said, he's not available. He said, well, I was just calling to, see if he was here. I'm an old friend of his. My name's Jim. I'll try him back next week. Don't worry about telling him I called. I'll just try him back. In the meantime, though, he had gotten the secretary's name. So what he did is he jumped off the phone, went online, and started searching for social media about the secretary. Spent a little time and found some pictures of her attending the company president's wedding, his daughter's wedding. She he took that information, downloaded some photos, and embedded a Trojan horse in the photos to place ransomware on the company servers. He then jumped online, emailed the photos to the secretary, and then called up a few minutes later and said, hey, I forgot while I was on the phone with you. I was at Jim's wedding and I saw you there, and I took some pictures. I think you might be in some of them. I've attached them here. Why don't you take a look? She, not thinking anything of it, opened them up, figured it was a friend of Jim's, looked at the pictures, and all of a sudden there was ransomware installed on the system. Before she ever even had a chance to tell her boss that, this guy Jim called and he said, I don't know any Jim, it was already too late. The ransomware was on the system. So those are, that's an example of a creative way that some of these scammers are getting into systems. Another one we've seen recently is this one I thought was really interesting. It was designed to take place on smartphones, and it was an email that was generally a blank white email. And if you tapped on it, you would see in the corner what looked like a little bit of fuzz. And you take your finger and you swipe away the fuzz. Well, the fuzz was actually a digital image, and when you tapped on the fuzz, it installed a Trojan into your phone. So people would get this email, they'd just swipe up and down their phone, they'd go to wipe away this little piece of fuzz on the screen and install malicious software on their phone. Another one we've seen recently is a way to try to get around two-factor authentication. For those of you who don't know, I highly recommend two-factor authentication as a way to protect your accounts. You should do it on every account where you possibly can. But there is a way for hackers to get around that. And again, it's through these phishing attempts and generally a call. What they'll do is if they have your phone number and your login information, maybe they got it on the dark web, maybe they got it somewhere else, but they have your information. They go to the bank, they type in your username and password, it goes to log in, and it asks for the text message that's been sent to your phone. They immediately call up your phone and they say, hi, this is John, I'm calling from, your bank. We're trying to make sure the security is working appropriately on your account. You should have just received a text message from us indicating a 6-digit passcode that we need to confirm that your bank account is accurate, that your login information is accurate. Obviously, talking to me right here, you wouldn't give that information, but some people do. Some people think, oh, well, that's just a coincidence. My bank happened to call me. They sent me this text message. I'm going to give them the code. So they read off the code, and on the other end, the hacker just types the code into their computer, and they log right into your bank account. So another thing to watch out for, what people are doing these days. Internet of Things based attacks are big right now, especially with people working from home. If you have smart devices in your house, if you've got an Alexa, if you've got smart TVs, anything that listens to you in particular, people try to hack into those to listen to what's going on in your house. Again, two-factor authentication is a good way to protect against that. And also, if you've got the type of router for it and if there's a way to set it up, I highly recommend setting up separate networks for those devices so they're not on with your other personal devices like your computers or especially your work computers. If you have work computers at home, try to use a VPN to connect to the office. These are all things that hopefully your IT department will be able to discuss with you, things that you can set up to try and protect home work environments. Also, watch out for third-party vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities at remote work locations. A lot of companies right now have set up remote environments for employees to work. Make sure those remote environments are secure. Even things like USB ports that are accessible, where somebody can just walk up and stick a dongle into a USB drive. It's things to watch out for. We tend to take care of those things in our primary office environments, but these remote work environments aren't nearly as secure. So definitely watch out for that as time goes on. Now, my sense is that I probably haven't talked about anything particularly novel here. This isn't anything you haven't heard before. But let's take a minute and compare what we just talked about to data privacy. Now, data privacy, unlike data security, isn't only concerned with protecting data, but it's more focused on the proper use and handling of data. Think of it this way. If you give a company your name, address, phone number, email address, things like that as part of, let's say, a job application, there are certain expectations that go along with providing that information. Now, you certainly expect that that information will be protected, of course, that makes sense. But there's also some implied limitations on the use of that data. For example, you don't expect that the company will also add your data to its mailing list, or that it'll use your telephone number to set up a rewards program or something like that. And you certainly don't expect that the company will sell your data to someone else. But think about traditional data security issues. You give the company your data. No one stole it. It's still secure. It's still in the company's systems, isn't it? No hacker accessed it. They didn't sell it on the dark web. There's nothing nefarious about it. Instead, the company that had a right to have your data, to maintain your data on its systems, exceeded the scope of that expected use. That's where data privacy comes into play. That's why privacy policies are so critical today, and it's why most countries outside the US have incredibly strict privacy laws, and why some states like California are starting to enact their own. Now, we're at a point where the US is probably going to start moving towards some sort of national data privacy policy, but it likely won't happen in the very near future. And ultimately, unlike data security, which is, again, focused on threats, data privacy is driven by those laws and regulations as well as consumer expectations. In fact, a recent poll showed that over 80% of US consumers would actually change service providers to another company if that other company took privacy more seriously than their existing provider. It's a big issue today. Now, also unlike security, data privacy is not solely an IT function. It hits every department. Think about it. Obviously, it's going to be part of IT. There's some security involved in it, of course, and there are things that they need to take care of. But IT is also the one that has to know where all the data is housed. How is it mapped? Where is it stored? Does it cross borders? Things like that. Legal and compliance, of course, are going to be involved. There are legal issues there. But think about your sales team. Your sales team needs to be able to collect information from potential customers, needs to be able to reach out to those customers, needs to have access to that data. But did those customers actually give you the right to use the data in that way? Are you allowed to do that under applicable law? Those are things that have to be considered. The same thing for human resources. We just talked about it. If somebody provides information as an employee, what can you do with that information? Where does it have to be stored? How does it have to be stored? How long can you keep it? Things like that are all considerations that have to be taken into account. Operations, the same thing. Everything in your company, every data point that touches on personal information of some kind has to be considered when you're talking about data privacy. It's everywhere. Now, the best way to look at data privacy is by considering three key factors that I note here: notice, transparency, and use. Under most data privacy laws, you're required to give your customers some sort of notice about what data you collect, notice how you're going to use that data, notice of whether you're going to sell that data to a third party, and notice of that consumer's privacy rights under applicable law. You have to be transparent about those items. You can't hide it in hard-to-read policies and difficult legal-filled terms. And you need to be sure that you actually use the data in a way that matches the promises you make to consumers. But why is this also important? Why is it at the forefront today? Companies have been using data for decades. Why is it just now that we're starting to talk about data privacy in this way? Well, it's a combination of things. Things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and the use of psychology and consumer metrics have really driven the tech industry to a point where data can easily be manipulated and misused to the detriment of consumers rather than being used for the consumer's benefit. For example, take a look at the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal that occurred a couple of years back. If you haven't watched The Big Hack or The Social Dilemma on Netflix, I highly encourage you to do that. They're really interesting, but the way that personal data can be manipulated and how it can affect our daily lives and the choices we make is thought-provoking to say the least. At a bare minimum, though, it drives home the point that data privacy is something everyone has to take seriously, both as a company and as a consumer. So, now that we have a better handle on the difference between security and privacy, let's revisit this quote. You can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. And think about it. If you've got a piece of private information, something that's supposed to be kept secure, certainly if you don't protect it, you have no privacy. But the thing that most people miss is that you can have security. You can have that piece of information as secure as it can possibly be. But if it's misused by the company or the person who's supposed to have it, you have no privacy. Now, I'd be remiss if we moved on from the privacy topic without talking for just a minute about the different privacy laws that are out there. So let's take a look for a moment at a state-by-state comparison of privacy laws that are out there. This map shows a good example of where privacy laws are currently enacted, where they're in committee, and what stage they're in. You can see it's almost across the entire US. Things are moving in that direction. Again, it's going to be a while before there's a national privacy law in the US just because of how politics are today, but states are making changes. States are putting things into play. Now, Michigan doesn't have anything right now, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It will happen sooner rather than later. The other important thing to remember when it comes to privacy is that unlike most other areas of law, privacy law isn't governed by where the corporation is. Privacy law is governed by where the consumers are. So if you're in Michigan and you've got customers in California, you may have to comply with the California Consumer Privacy Act. The same thing, if you're in Michigan and you have customers in Nevada, you may have to comply with Nevada's privacy laws. So it's really important to get a handle on not only where you are and what information you have, but where your consumers are located. And once you have... Now that's something a privacy professional can absolutely help with, and I'd highly encourage you to reach out to engage in that conversation. But for now, let's move on. Again, now that we have a better handle on the distinction between security and privacy, let's push the security topic to the side for a bit and talk about privacy issues. In particular, in the COVID era, what data are we collecting? How can it be used? And what are some of the pitfalls to consider? Now, certainly many of you have collected personal data in the past, and you probably continue to do so today. But COVID has brought an entirely new subset of data to the forefront. This is a list of just some of the more common items we have to address. So let's dive a bit deeper into these. Symptoms and test result reporting. For those who have reopened offices at any scale, you probably have some sort of service that provides screening for employees, or maybe you do it yourself. It probably asks questions like whether the person has had any COVID symptoms, whether they've been in contact with anyone who tested positive, whether they have traveled outside the state or country, or whether they have had to quarantine at all in the past. There's no question this is invasive data. These aren't the types of questions we'd typically be comfortable asking or willing to answer. But most of us do it today because it's just the world we live in. But let's take a step back from what we're allowed to do, or even required to do under applicable law. Now, I know my partner Mark Knoth provided another webinar, and our employment law team is well positioned to answer any questions about what you can and have to do in terms of data collection. But let's assume for our purposes here that you either have to collect this data or you're allowed to collect it and you've chosen to do so. Does that mean you're done? Well, not necessarily. First, let's take a look at how that collection might occur, where the data is stored, and who might have access to it. Now, these points listed here are just some of the things you need to consider about the COVID-related data that you're collecting. Where is it stored? If you develop the system in-house, is it on your server? Is it encrypted? Is it properly protected? If it's a third-party software, do they store the data on their servers? What do their protections look like? If data is stored either on your system or elsewhere, how long is it retained? Is the retention period appropriate under applicable law? Can you retain the information at all? What kind of control do you have over that retention? Who has access to the information? Can your employees see it? Can some other entity like your service provider and its employees see the data in the system? If your employees can see it, do you have it properly protected with the right levels of restricted access so that only those employees that should be able to access the data can do so? What about data sharing arrangements? Are you sharing this data with anyone? Is your service provider sharing it with anyone? Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, Jeff, this is why I hired someone else to handle it. I didn't want to deal with all these questions. And sure, you have a great point there. But did you ask these questions when you hired your service provider? How do you know that that third-party service system that you put in place to track your employees or customers is built appropriately and is secure? How do you know that they're doing the right thing? Now, you may be right. Everything might be perfectly fine. But let me share a couple of examples of why this is a problem. Back in May, Mashable reported that the Kerr 19 app developed for the North Dakota Department of Health, that's right, the state-level contact tracing app, was actively sharing location data with Foursquare. Despite the app's privacy policy saying that, quote, location data will not be shared with anyone including government entities or third parties unless you consent or proud crowd is compelled to federal regulations." Unquote. The app did just that. It shared location data with a third party, and not just any third party, with a social media network. Notably, a close review of the app itself would indicate that the information was being shared, and that's important. But the app apparently ended its data sharing in June after substantial bad press. The fact remains that a lack of due diligence on the part of the state of North Dakota resulted in a substantial privacy issue for their residents. And the same could easily happen to any business that isn't careful. Now, closer to home, in August, TechCrunch reported that on the Aura tracing app used at Albion College. Now, this app is mandatory for all students. It includes real-time geolocation services. Now, set aside for a moment the argument regarding privacy and whether a student should be required to provide location data to a school on a real-time basis. Let's assume for a minute that that's okay. The app itself had major security flaws. A security researcher found hard-coded secret keys in the app's source code, which allowed her to access patient data, including COVID-19 test results with names, addresses, and birth dates of students. The other issue, more of a design flaw than anything else, allowed users to pull up other users' information and infer test results based on the data provided. The point is that Albion College relied on this third party to provide its app, and that third party entirely failed on the security side. The takeaway here isn't that everything's going to be perfect, and it's certainly not that the world's falling apart. But you probably should, especially if you're using third parties, make sure that the app was developed and implemented appropriately. You have to do that. You have to be sure that you properly vet the company, that the apps and the processes in place are proper before you select that provider. From a legal perspective, at a minimum, have your counsel review the agreements with that third-party provider to ensure that the app developer will be held responsible if anything goes wrong. Likewise, there are issues related to video monitoring of employees and collection of customer contact information that needs to be considered, primarily what you can do with that information once it's in your possession. For example, if you collect information for contact tracing purposes, you can't necessarily use that information for marketing purposes. I think at a base level we understand that, but it's tempting to use it, especially when you have it in your possession. If you want to use it, you should, as we discussed earlier, provide the customer with proper notice of your intent to use the information in that manner and get the proper consent to do so. If the customer doesn't provide that consent, or worse yet, if they affirmatively tell you not to use it in that manner, you shouldn't exceed the scope of that use you disclosed at the time of collection. Now, let's assume you have properly collected all the information, that everything you have in place is properly secured, and that you don't intend to misuse any information. I'm sure that's the position most of you are in. Now, for better or worse, and it certainly depends on who you ask, working from home has become a part of everyday life for a lot of people, and it's likely going to continue that way for the near future. But your obligations to protect and properly use data don't end at your firewall. If users have remote access, there are certainly some things that you have to consider moving forward. Now, unfortunately, I can't give you a list of specific do's and don'ts in terms of data privacy because, as we discussed, the applicable law isn't based on where you're located. It's based on where your customers are located. So rather than that sort of list, I've provided a list of things to consider and some key drivers that match up with related obligations. So let's spend some time here. The first thing you have to consider is what type of information do you have. Now I have listed PI, PII, PHI, or business information. Now PI is personal information, PII is personally identifiable information, and PHI is protected health information. All these are different definitions under applicable data privacy laws, and it's certainly something to consider. But what I really want you to do is focus on the difference between personal information and business information. And the reason I say that is because if you're protecting just confidential business information, the applicable law is different. What you have to look at is just how you want to protect that information. There probably aren't any specific regulations governing how you protect your own business information. But if you have personal information or personally identifiable information, things like name, address, telephone number, social security number, the list goes on. And it even includes things like internet protocol address, email, usernames, things that you wouldn't normally think of as personal information might be considered personal information under certain laws. So the way I want you to think about it is any information that if you tried to tie it back to a particular individual, it could be tied back to that individual, that could probably be considered personal information under some applicable data privacy law. If you have that type of information, it changes the law that applies, and it's based on where that individual is located rather than where you're located. So you certainly have to start by considering the type of information you have. If you have any of that type of information, you have to consider where those people are located. Are they in the US? Are they international? If they're in the US, are they in California? Now, I use these locations in particular because, as I noted earlier, most countries outside the US have really strict data privacy laws. They vary from country to country, and of course there are some outliers that don't have them. But for the most part, most countries have data privacy laws that are going to protect their citizens. And even if you're located in the US, if you have customers located in those countries, those laws may apply, so you need to consider that. Now, if you are located in the US, click back a few slides, go back a little bit, and take a look at the map that I provided to see if you have customers in a state where there is a data privacy law or one that might take effect soon. If you do, again, consider whether those laws apply, and I highly recommend you talk to counsel to figure that out because it's going to change the way you approach your data protection. Once you've got that nailed down, take a look at who needs to access the data. Do remote workers need to access that data? Now, I'm going to focus on remote workers here because we're talking about a COVID environment, but it's something you absolutely have to consider. If remote workers need to access it, you need to look at the type of access they have. And that takes us down to that next line, is encryption required? Most personal information under most applicable data privacy laws requires that you encrypt it in some way, either at rest, in transit, or both. You need to make sure that encryption is in place because if you're sending data from your office to an employee that's working remotely, if that data is encrypted at your office, it's not necessarily encrypted in transit to your employee, or more importantly, as it's sitting on your employee's home computer. And if you're required to encrypt it by applicable law, that's something you have to consider in how you set up your systems. Finally, where is that data located? I have noted here, are there any cross-border data transfers? The important thing about this is the way privacy law is structured, particularly in the EU, but in other places as well. If you have information on a resident or a citizen of a particular location, and that citizen is given consent to have their data stored in a particular country, and you decide to transfer that data to another country for any reason, you either have to give proper notice and consent or have the right structure in place to do that in compliance with the law. For example, if you have employees that are located in the EU, and those employees give consent to have their information stored by your company in the EU, and you have a remote worker here in the US, and that remote worker accesses a server that's located in the EU at your location there, and the employee didn't give consent to have their information sent from the EU to the US, you could be violating EU privacy law by doing that. Now, there's no blanket statements. I'm not going to say that you absolutely are, but you need to at least look into it to make sure that you're not, because there are enough concerns there and there are enough regulations in place that it's important to take a look. Now, here in the United States, we don't have any cross-border issues from state to state, for example. So if you've got customers in California and your California customers give you consent to store things there and you transfer it from California to, say, Michigan, that's likely not going to be an issue. But again, if you've got any customers overseas and they're providing information, it's something that you should seriously take a look at. Now, down here on the bottom, I've listed a couple of key drivers and the obligations related to them. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just an example of some of the things to consider. First, do you have any particularly sensitive personal information or health information? Things like social security numbers, credit card numbers, protected health information. Those things need to be encrypted at rest and in transit, no matter what. So make sure that information is encrypted. If you have any customers in California or the EU, right now those are the two big ones. Those are areas where they have very strict data privacy laws. California is going to become even more strict as we move forward. And over in the EU, the GDPR is one of the big hot button issues and has been for the last few years. So again, if you have any information on data subjects that are located in California or the EU, you should absolutely talk to counsel to make sure that you are compliant with the obligations under those laws. And finally, of course, if you have any data on minors, anytime minors are involved, anytime you're storing their data, you need to ensure you have the proper consents in place. You need to ensure that you're handling that information correctly. So you should absolutely talk to counsel again if you're storing any information on minors. Now, this brings us to one of our most important points of the topic: security challenges under a COVID-19 environment. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time here, and as you can see, we're going to talk about some of the issues you have to face when working from home and some of the security challenges you face when trying to protect remote access. Let's start with some of the work from home challenges. Now, we touched briefly on access levels earlier, but this is particularly important with remote workers. Consider what level of access your remote workers need. What levels of confidentiality do you have in the documents that you're providing? Are there varying levels of access? One thing you shouldn't do is provide every remote worker the same level of access. There's probably no need for that. You should be able to set up different levels of access based on need so that people can access the files that they need for their work. If you do that, you're going to protect the higher levels of access in case those accounts are compromised. Now, the equipment that your employees are using is also a big thing to consider. Are they using personal devices? Are they using mobile devices? Are they using corporate approved devices? This is something you should absolutely consider when allowing people to access your network, particularly remotely. If your employees are sitting at home on their personal computers and you're giving them access to your company network, you're taking a lot of risk there in allowing whatever's on their personal computer to access or invade your network. You can certainly require them to have certain types of antivirus software, certain types of malware detection, the typical security things that you'd put in place. But allowing company approved devices only is certainly a recommended way to go. It's certainly a best practice. That's what our firm does. If you want to access the company network, you can only do so on a company approved device. Personal devices can't access the network. And in that same light, you should consider the access methods for the network and the access methods for files. Are you going to use some type of software as a service that allows your documents to sit out there on the cloud? There are certainly security benefits and risks to that. One of the things I always find interesting is that people think the cloud is less secure than their network at their office. That's not necessarily the case. There are certainly softwares out there and services out there that are not secure. But when you consider whether a company like, say, Amazon or Microsoft is able to secure their environment compared to whether you're able to secure your environment at the office, it's pretty likely that the Amazon environment is going to be highly secure. Additionally, when you think about the type of information that's being stored out there, in general, security is not one of the things to be concerned about when using one of these big software as a service providers. Obviously, like we talked about earlier, anytime you have a third-party service provider, you want to consider who that provider is, whether they've got a good reputation, whether it looks like they're doing things the right way. You want to have your IT department vet it, and you should certainly have your attorneys take a look at the agreements that you sign when you're entering into those relationships. But by and large, it's not necessarily proper to look at things and say just because this is stored out in the cloud or out online, it's less secure. In fact, when you really consider how these networks are set up, your server at your office is just another computer on the cloud. So looking at these as a security bonus instead of just a security negative is certainly something to consider. Additionally, VPN access. Setting up a VPN for your office, this isn't anything new, but anytime you're accessing your network remotely, it should be done over a VPN. Especially if you're using any sort of public Wi-Fi. And again, we'll talk about that as we move down here to one of these other points. And then email. What email system are you using? What providers are you going to allow? Are your remote workers allowed to use something like Gmail, or do they have to use a company proprietary email that's more secure? All these are considerations when allowing people to access remotely. And now we move on to probably my favorite topic, training. There's not a whole lot of time that needs to be spent here, even though it is my favorite topic. We talked earlier about how most security professionals will say that company users are the biggest vulnerability in any system, and that is absolutely true. And training is the only way to really help alleviate that problem. training employees not only on how to use the system appropriately, but on security vulnerabilities, training on how to spot phishing attempts, how to spot voice phishing attempts, how to spot what a spam email looks like, things like that. There are services out there, there are softwares out there that can help with that training. It should be ongoing. It shouldn't be a one-time thing. Training your employees regularly on security vulnerabilities is the only way to mitigate some of these issues. When considering remote work sites, you should consider not only official remote work sites, but remote work sites like your local coffee shop. Employees may consider those to be remote work sites. There's nothing wrong necessarily with working at those locations, but doing it appropriately is important. You should always try to avoid public Wi-Fi whenever possible. If you have an adapter on your phone or a way to access a remote hotspot that you control, that's certainly the best way to go. There are inherent vulnerabilities in public Wi-Fi. If you're forced to use public Wi-Fi, you should absolutely use a VPN to connect to anything you're going to do that has a confidential nature. Another one of these war stories that I can share, I was at a conference a few years ago, and there was a session called Watch a 13-Year-Old Hack Your Network. And what this kid did is he got up on stage and he set up a little remote hotspot that he brought by himself, and he named it Google Starbucks. And all he did was display what was coming over his hotspot up on the screen. And it was interesting to see how many people had their phones set up to automatically connect to Google Starbucks. And as soon as it connected, the first thing it did was start to pass through work information, in particular login information, to log into the corporate sites. So you were able to see this 13-year-old kid just turned on this hotspot that he had created and automatically started seeing information that should have been proprietary. It would be easy enough for somebody to go into a Starbucks, turn on something like that, and have the network pass right through to the internet, so that from your perspective it seems like you're logged right into Google Starbucks, when in fact you're logged into somebody else's device and they're watching all the network traffic. So again, avoid those Wi-Fi hotspots, turn off your auto connect for sure, and if you have to connect in some situations, make sure that you at least don't send any personal information or any confidential information until you're connected to a VPN. And finally, Internet of Things devices. Again, we talked about this briefly earlier. If you can segregate those on your home network, you should. And home network security in itself is important. Make sure you have an updated router. Make sure the router's firmware is updated. Make sure you're keeping things up to date at home so that you have the latest and greatest security protection, particularly if you're working on sensitive information. The worst thing you can do is leave your home network vulnerable to the point where somebody can invade your home network and tie right through your computer into your office network. Now finally, we're going to wrap up tonight with just a couple bullet points on how to protect remote access. I think this is a good quick reference guide with some of the things we've talked about and some additional things that you can do to protect yourself as we work in a remote environment. First, again, protect your home and remote network connections. Use an encrypted router connection where available. Most modern routers have this. It's something you shouldn't have to go out and buy a new router for, but you should definitely check, especially if your router's older. You want to make sure it's up to date. You want to get a new one if you have to make sure that everything's encrypted. Again, never work on a public wireless network. I say never ever. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Again, if you have to, make sure you're working over a VPN, which pulls us down to our next topic, secure your connection. Only connect to your office networks over a VPN. There are a few other ways to do it if your system is set up for it. Talk to your IT department. Make sure your connection is secure. Only connect to office networks on pre-approved devices. There really should never be a reason to connect a personal device to an office network. Now, you may have a separate network at your office where you can use your mobile devices. If your IT department has set that up, that's great. If it's not set up, if you're using the same network as all your computers, you should seriously consider setting up a separate network for that. Don't install any unapproved software on your office machines. Shadow IT is one of the biggest problems these days, where people feel that if they're working from home, they should be able to install whatever they want on their laptops or their desktops. When you do that, you create security holes. There's unapproved software out there all over the place. Make sure you're only using approved software on company devices. If possible, segment your home networks. A work and home network separated so that your company device is on one segment and your home devices are on others is great. At a minimum, if possible, you should separate your Internet of Things devices. There's no reason you should have your TV, your microwave, your Alexa, all of that tied into your main network. Those are security vulnerabilities that can be easily avoided, especially on modern network devices. It's easy enough to set up a second network. If you're working at home and you don't know how to do that, I imagine that your office IT department may be willing to assist with that because it'll help protect company information. On a personal and professional level, try to use multi-factor authentication wherever it's available, whether it's bank accounts, email accounts, game accounts, software as a service accounts, your VPN, work email accounts, any place you can do it. Two-factor authentication is the best way to go to secure yourself. It's always going to be more secure than just a password. When you're using virtual meeting rooms, secure them as much as possible. Use company-approved applications. Zoom is great. If your company hasn't approved it though, don't just jump out there and use it. Make sure your company's approved it. If they haven't approved it, there's probably a reason. If you do use any of these virtual meeting rooms, use the waiting room feature, use password options. I know it's tempting. It's easier to allow people to just jump right into a meeting with you, but people can jump into those meetings too easily. The waiting room option is fantastic on most of these systems. It allows you to see who's trying to join before they can just jump into the meeting. And password protection, particularly if you're in a particularly sensitive meeting, is a great way to go. Lock down USB ports and change default passwords. This is something your IT department should be doing, especially with offices as empty as they are right now. It's easy enough for somebody to walk in, go to an unused room, and stick a dongle into a USB port that gives them access to that computer and potentially access to the entire network. USB ports can be locked down to where they're unusable unless approved. That's a great way to go for machines, especially if they aren't used on a regular basis. It's great on remote machines too. If you have your laptop at a coffee shop and somebody can just walk up when you're looking the other way or up getting a refill to stick something into your drive to download information or get access to your computer, you want to avoid that if at all possible. Changing default passwords is another one. It's an easy fix. There's no reason that your router should still be user admin password. Make sure you change those, particularly for devices that are going to be visible to the public. If it's anything where the public can find the IP address and access it to see who's on there, change those passwords as soon as you possibly can. And finally, make sure your IT department checks your firewall and server configurations. Making sure those are up to date and properly configured is absolutely critical from a security perspective. When it comes to home, I know there are products out there now that are home firewalls. There are companies out there that provide firewall services to set you up at home so that you have a more secure environment at home. If you're working on particularly sensitive information, that's certainly something to consider. And with that, I want to thank you again for taking the time to watch this webinar. I hope you found it enlightening. I hope you found it helpful. And of course, if you have any questions, if there's anything we can do to help, feel free to reach out anytime.